How are you
Yeah.
doing?
Um, it's been very interesting, just doing this research over the last 6 months and just how relevant things have gotten. So I will allow myself to introduce myself to the stream. My name is Eva. My pronouns are she, her. I am a grad student, a teacher, historian, writer, um, and I primarily specify, or my specialty is the history of eugenics in the United States, specifically with Connecticut. And then I also focus on resistance movements to eugenics.
Nice.
So, yeah. So the reason I had reached out to you, like, I don't know, 8 months ago, um, was because there was, I believe, if I recall, there was like a first iteration of this anti trans legislation that was coming out. And I recall that, you were comparing it to Nazi Germany, and you're making a lot of allusions to, the Weimar Republic and how things transitioned in that way. And a lot of people had said that you were being hyperbolic and just like too much at the time
And now,
about
but now, you know.
oh, but now, right, exactly. And so, had that no longer been relevant anymore to the discourse, I probably would have been like, all right, it's not worth even talking about anymore. But it just seems like that much more urgent now more than ever to talk about this history, to realize that eugenics is not just something that happened in 1920s, and then like Nazi Germany took it and ran with it and now it's gone. That's not the case at all. And in fact, eugenics, over time, it reproduced itself, and it molded itself to fit within the crisis of the time period and to fit within the rhetoric and the discourse that was at any given point. And then there are times where it's more popular, and these are times of crisis, economic crisis, and environmental crisis, and these things get more and more pronounced. Oh, my cat is like clawing at me. Do you want to see him?
Go ahead.
Ah, come here. Ooh, this is Apple.
Oh, hello.
Apple Scruffs. So now
Did
he
they just
sings.
meow or did they
Yeah.
okay, good. Important.
So anywho, um, he lost my train of thought. So yeah, as I was saying, so eugenics over time, it just like it molded and reproduced itself to fit within the rhetoric and what was popular at the time.
Yeah,
So
so
anywho,
that's actually the reason why our conversation was delayed so much. It was a high IQ effort to hit at it when it was even more prominent in the discourse than it was previously. So
mhm.
we've seen a pretty clear progression over the past few years with regards to the discussion of trans people, where a couple of years ago, the conservative narrative about trans people was that they were poor and delusional, but ultimately it was like a sympathetic view. It was fake sympathy, but it was still sympathy. The idea like, oh, they're deluded, they don't know that men can't be women, blah, blah, blah. But, ultimately we conservatives are just concerned for their well-being by pushing back against this destructive ideology. And now, of course, like we're seeing very explicit, undifferentiated attacks, not only on the identity of the group, but also on like their innate value as humans. And things have moved so quickly, and I feel like the signs were always there, but the more the further along we've gotten, the easier it is to identify how bad it's getting.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think another really important distinction to make, and this is something that I don't know if it's going to come as a surprise to anyone, but looking at like early sexology research, you see that the distinction between who was pathologized and who was criminalized are distinctly along racial and class lines. And so, if someone was, a Black trans woman, they are considered, degenerate, criminal, pedophiles, you name it. And then if they were an affluent white man, cis man, then they are mentally ill and deluded. and that they needed, counseling. And they even said that they were exposed to too much civilization, that they were over civilized, and so they needed reform and to go along with what is considered, normal gender and sexuality. But that's the question, is like, what is normal? What is defined as normal within this society, within this framework? Is it just to procreate, have babies, continue the white race as they wanted it and envisioned it, and then try to sterilize, execute whatever they wanted to do to everybody else and contain them? And that's why there's the construction of this mass incarceration system, and the asylum system, was to house people and take them out of society so
Yeah,
that nobody else had to deal with it.
I've always argued that the anti-trans bathroom bills were also pretty overtly genocidal, because if you take a trans woman, let's say, very obviously feminine trans woman, and you say, well, you can't use the women's restrooms, that's legal, and then if you're in the men's restrooms, you're at a high risk of, at the minimal, ostracization and at maximum violence, and the effective answer to that is, well, you just can't use public restrooms. And the denial of public services like that effectively means, like, you're cut out of, public restrooms aren't like a luxury. They're like a necessary thing to being outside. We're not all pissing in bushes, or at least I assume we aren't all. And if you can't do that, you're kind of precluded from like areas that don't already have gender neutral restrooms, and even that's not a guarantee.
Right. And that's the other thing that I've been looking into as time goes on, is this idea of like gay geography and queer geography in general, of like what spaces are people allowed to occupy. And it kind of seems like a distant memory to many people. And I guess like we're coming back into this time period, where congregating as a queer person in a public space was against the law. And and so these bars, these spaces that were created for people to seek to and to form community, were a space of subversion. And nowadays, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I'm in Connecticut, and it's pretty progressive as far as the United States goes. And so, the normalization of gay bars has been a thing probably since the 80s.
Mhm.
And the amount of gay bars in the 80s and 90s, there were so many. I mean, almost every city had a few, or like at least one, and then the major ones had like a few. And now you'll be lucky if, I think there's like maybe 8, something like that. And those are specifically cis gay bars. There are very few queer spaces. There are no lesbian bars. And that's just one example of, as time went on, and queer people had become more and more ingrained into mainstream society, as, after, this is also after like post civil rights and all that.
Mhm.
They were able to go to a regular bar and just be themselves. But now, we're definitely experiencing this regression. And as far as trans people goes, within the history, I know I was just talking to, because like part of my project is incorporating oral histories and incorporating the oral history tradition when we're talking about resistance movements, because the dominant, media class is not going to write, they're not going to write you into history. And if you look at the primary source documents that exist, there's very few that talk about, never mind trans identity, they barely even talk about homosexuality.
Well, if
So,
because, and you can see a lot of this and the value of this from a reactionary perspective, because when they talk about like the 1950s or 40s, they act as though gay people just didn't exist, like they were just totally removed from society. When in reality, like there was a very active policing of laws pertaining to like gender incongruence or sodomy, where like the police
Mhm.
would constantly actually arrest people, raid bars, harass people for wearing the wrong gender clothing or this, that, the other, but it gets erased out of history. So when in retrospect, people look back in it and they're like, ah, yes, of course. Well, basically everyone was just straight, and then gay people just kind of happened in the 60s, when
Yeah.
the war has been ongoing for a long time.
And you'll even see it from like older historians, and it's kind of like a running joke and has turned into a meme that like historians will be like, "Oh, they were really good friends," when it's just
Right.
so obvious they weren't. They were partners, or and obviously, sexuality and gender over the years has definitely transformed, and how people relate to it and relate to one another or relate to themselves, is definitely changed over the years. And there's nothing, you can't deny that. But that's also how culture has shifted. I mean, in the language that we use, there are words that we no longer use in our dialectic that they had back then, that are the same things. Like a lesbian relationship back then would have been called a Boston marriage. And it's like more or less the same thing. But and not understanding that the way that people related to sexuality, for a time period, it was just something you did and not definitive of who you are, if that makes sense. And at some point that shifted. And it was definitely in this time where eugenics was being, not only published, but validated in all of these academic spheres. And that's like a very important thing to keep in mind about eugenics, is it wasn't just like a few people who had some really fringe ideas. This was dispersed all throughout public life. And places, institutions like Yale University, they created the American Eugenics Society, founded by Robert Yerkes, Irving Fisher. These were Yale professors. I think one of them was a president too, if I'm not mistaken. And like they put out this rhetoric that was like, yes, this is a legitimate science, and these are the categories of people, and this is how we are going to identify these people with these specific behaviors. And so that's when it became more of this identity marker and less about just how people moved about in
Yeah,
society.
and I mean at the time, like it wasn't even just eugenics was popular. It was that eugenics was unambiguously popular with progressives too, because there
Yeah.
wasn't sociology basically didn't exist back then. So just the idea of someone going, well, we know evolution's a thing, and we can, we know that we've made dog breeds, so couldn't we just make humans better? Smiley face. Like that was something everyone thought in some form or another, and some people immediately were like, ah, yes, race war, but a lot of people were like, well, okay, well, obviously, we could all just be 8 feet tall. Wouldn't that be cool? Don't you want to be 8 feet tall? And like, even an upstanding, urban, educated, progressive type, I think, would have been into some form of eugenics back then, because there was very little understanding of the way these systems enforce themselves.
Hmm. Exactly. And there was, I'd say by like 1937-ish, people were starting to catch on that maybe this isn't the right thing. There were always people pushing back against it. There was always scholarship being published to dispute and refute this as a science. And in fact, the American Eugenics Society was started to legitimize it because there was always doubt in there. Um, so that is important to keep in mind. But by 1937, as Hitler was starting to do his thing, and it was starting to be like, okay, maybe this isn't the right course of action. People pulled away from it. But again, they changed the language. So a great example that I have is the Sterilization League of New Jersey. It was started by this woman, Marion Olden, and she traveled to Germany to translate a propaganda film that was like about sterilization.
Mhm.
She came back to the U.S. and at that point, again, it was just like not getting a good reputation, so they changed Sterilization League of New Jersey. They changed the name to Birthright Incorporated, and they changed the language of their aims. And so instead of them saying, some people aren't, meant to breed, so let's sterilize them, instead they changed it to say, well, we need to protect children, and children deserve to be born into a family with two stable parents, and who are financially sound and of sound mind and body. And it's like, yeah, okay, sure, like, yeah, every child deserves that. But then they're like, so we're going to sterilize these people. So the goal was the same. They just changed the framing. And I think it's also key that, like, they shift it to the children. That's a lot of parallels what we're seeing now. Because how can you argue? How can you argue? Like, oh, you don't want that for children?
Yeah, well, you always do this, right? Like, literally anything you do, it's for the kids. Like, they literally said that the Holocaust was for the kids because the purging of, like, the German folk was necessary to secure a future, literally secure a future for our children. Like that, the 14 words refers to this. It's a ubiquitous, like, advocacy method. When like, obviously they don't give a fuck about kids. They just have their own, like, social programs they care about. I assume that back in the early days of American eugenics, there were more people who in good faith would have thought, like, oh yeah, of course, like, we want to promote good health and we want to promote, like, good social standing for the, but as time goes on, like, especially with Nazi Germany, right? Because then we all kind of see where the eugenics movement goes in the long run. You have to be more and more malicious to be a participant in the movement. And I think even like right now, there's still discussion of this. Like CRISPR, the idea of, like, well, you could get rid of hereditary diseases if you were, edit, like, some stuff out when babies are still in the womb or whatever. But I feel like that desire is kind of secondary to what a lot of the early eugenicists really cared about, which is a kind of social purification. There are good people and bad people, and you can tell who the bad people are because they're smelly and they're homeless and they're on the street and they don't speak good English. And eugenics is just a method of not getting that, you know? And
Yeah.
obviously that's bad, but I think initially it was kind of muddy, like the idea of how bad you'd have to get to pursue that.
Yeah, it's a policy based action. They use it's not a science. This ideology of disdain to justify and using the scientific method as a means to justify whatever action they want. And that's the thing about eugenics, is like the logical conclusion is always genocide. It's never anything else. You start with one thing and, like, oh, we want to do, of course we just have like, here's another example. On the US Mexico border back in, like, 1917 or 18, there was a typhus outbreak. And so they were like, okay, we need to install quarantine stations so that we can make sure that, the typhus coming from Juarez doesn't get to El Paso. And so they said, okay, well, if you are suspected of having lice, you need to strip down and take a shower with soap, water, and kerosene. And yeah, and so, of course, there was an uprising. It was like a 200 women's riot resisting this policy. The riot was suppressed. The policy continued until, like, 1956, something crazy. But they used this typhus outbreak as a means of creating this whole militarization of the border, and to police the border and to police people's bodies and domestic workers who are just going from the next town over. Now they no longer can do that without being forced to strip down naked in front of, an American guard. Now that policy, again, it evolved. Once the typhus outbreak was over, they still maintained this perspective that that Mexican people or Latino people were bringing in disease. into the country. And so they then were spraying people with Zyklon B and then later DDT. And so there is actually some German journal that Hitler like basically gave the U.S. a shout out for our U.S. Mexico border policy. So there's direct evidence that he was looking at our work, and within that journal, they actually showed images of the quarantine facility and how they were implementing cyanide gas treatments for people's clothing and stuff,
Right.
as kind of a blueprint for the extermination camps in Germany. And so, yeah, I mean, again, my point in all of this is to say that, you know, if you think that it can't happen here, you've got like liberal brain rot, and you need to be aware that this is absolutely happening, and we need to we need to respond in kind. We need to, and whatever that means to every individual. For me, it's educating people as much as physically possible. You know, and for other people, it might be learning more self-defense tactics. For some, it's just simply donating money to, you know, trans people that you know, because they might need to get out of the place that they're in. And it's also our job as cis people to really push this urgency, and that this is really, really dangerous, and it is absolutely happening here. This is, I mean, I was just watching earlier that you were showing like Matt Walsh, and like,
Great
a
guy.
perfect example. Ugh, like so fucking evil and gross. So, I mean, yeah, these are the people, and yeah, they're consolidating, right? They are forming their groups because this is going to be their primary messaging. And we have to really be aware of what is going to go on for 2024 because of this.
Yeah, it thinks it's, you know, that it can happen here messaging is really important to reaffirm, because I think a lot of people don't really understand. It's not just a matter of how close we are to a lot of these policies, right? The idea that like anti-sodomy laws, which the Texas AG said he would be willing to enforce, literally like just arresting people for being gay. Or the laws where you can be arrested for having 3 articles of clothing that don't match your gender, like in New York back in the 1960s. It's not just a matter of how close we are to those. You have to consider the relative social weight of returning to those policies after we've moved away from them. So this isn't to downplay any of the stuff that was going on back in the 1950s or anything, right? That's a big example, right? Segregation, right? Not a good thing, I've heard. Historians, they're still debating this. I think it wasn't a good thing. But to maintain segregation as the status quo back in the 1950s, it took a certain amount of effort. The effort it would take to bring society today back to that point would be monstrously large, incomprehensibly. It would be larger than any internal social movement that has ever rocked this country. It would be impossible. Likewise with gay and trans people, right? These laws against gay and trans people, they were only cut short relatively recently. To bring things back to that point after we've had the public visibility of gay and trans people, their social prominence, it is a much greater expression of effort, to roll it back like that. And I think we have to remember they're willing to do that, which means the comparative level of genocidal intention on display here is, I think, far greater than just, oh, well, we'd be going back 20 years. Because that doesn't sound that bad, right? Like, oh, okay, we go back 20 years. Like, all right, well, time marches on. We'll get back to this. It's much worse than that,
Yeah. 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 Keep going. Sorry.
Oh, no. Just that. It is, conservatives will always do this, like, by conservatism, by radical Nazism, what they actually mean is we believe in the values of the 1950s. To return to the values of the 1950s would require like 3.4 giga Hitlers. I mean, we would need just a preposterous amount of energy, far worse than just the latent energy of reactionary effort it would have taken to maintain the status quo back then. It's just a lot worse than that. Sorry, I'm not expressing my point very clearly here. I only mean to say the argument that, oh, we're just returning to the recent past is bullshit. because you can't just dial things back instantly. You have to undo everything, and that's just an ungodly amount of effort to do.
Yeah, and also this notion that like the tides of justice just like keep pushing in our favor, and we just got to like keep up the old hope and spirit that like things will work in the way that we think that we'd like it to, um, is also inaccurate. And that the things that I've seen throughout this research is that it's with the work of people pushing back directly against this all the time, putting their bodies on the line, taking the risks for their communities. Now, the challenge that I'm seeing now, and I don't know if this is just like my own jaded, isolated self, but like I said, this diminishing of queer spaces and safe spaces for people to be in the public space is kind of terrifying. And yes, like oh, it's like, of course, I'm not saying that like we need to be segregated from people, but queer people do need their own designated space. That is theirs and theirs only. And with this legislation that's coming out, that's like less and less a thing, less and less of a possibility. And so things like, you know, technology, the fact that we're even able to have this conversation right now just shows that like we have it, we have tools at our fingertips that, you know, people 20, 30, 40 years ago didn't have. So we can use those tools to our advantage and sort of network and keep this going. Because we're going to have to directly do something. It's not going to be thought in, you know, the legislatures. It's not that they're not going to make the right decisions. I honestly don't really have any faith in Democrats either, because all of these fights that were won were because of average people, normal people, not political people, taking direct action and challenging this dominant belief and challenging our definitions of normal, to assure our safety.
Well, I have it on good
So
authority that only gay people are watching this stream, so we do at least for a moment still have that those designated spaces. I yeah, I mean the ultimate goal of liberation along these lines is a complete lack of categorical distinction between gay or straight people or cis and trans, because it'll be utterly unremarkable in the way that we don't socially designate between blue-eyed and brown-eyed people. Obviously, we're not quite there yet. We're a
no,
little ways away from that. And it's, you know, resisting that is obviously a you know, it's going to be a Herculean effort moving forward.